Mr. Arif Hasan to Dev Talks. Arif Hasan is an architect and social activist. He is also the recipient of Hilal Imtiaz, one of Pakistan's highest awards. And today we hope to learn a little more about his work in development. Without further ado, Mr. Hasan, could you please briefly outline your mapping and housing project?
Well, I am basically trained as an architect, but it was my good fortune that very early I got involved with fighting against forced evictions. And that was my own involvement, my own thinking. But in the process, I met someone called Ghulam Kibriya. He was an engineer who was head of the appropriate technology development organization in Pakistan. So I worked with him for many years, and in working for him, I discovered a world in which I could play a role, developing technical solutions for communities that were disadvantaged, that didn't have funds, so you could help them save, have saving programs for them, and develop low-cost solutions for them. So among the low-cost solutions that were developed were local hydels on small streams. They were for dehydration of vegetables so that they could be kept during winter months, etc. A lot of innovation. And one of the innovations that was housing. And housing was all about roofs. Walls anyone can put up. But when it comes to roofs, especially if you want to build another floor above that, then you have problems. And it's expensive. So I got involved in housing with the appropriate development organization. And also, what was very important, that with the appropriate technology development organization, we looked into why are sewage systems so expensive that people cannot afford them. And I understood one thing from this work that I did, that affordability was important. If projects and if components were affordable to the community, you have a national program. If they function on subsidy, you have a project. I think this is what I learned. But anyway, then came General Ziaul-Haq's government, and I and Ghulam Kibriya, we both resigned from our posts because they were government posts. And I started my own work after that, which was mainly teaching. But in 1981, Akhtar Hamid Khan called me to Orangi to set up the sanitation and housing components. So then I worked with him, setting up these components. And until, I think, 2003, 2004, I managed this and developed it. But by then, Praveen had already, I think, become sort of qualified or involved enough in this work for me to say goodbye to it and leave it to her. So after that, it was mainly Praveen's work and not mine. So that is a brief thing. Then I've taught what I learned, and there is something known as the Comprehensive Environmental Design Project that is undertaken by architecture students in a number of institutions. I introduced it in the Dawood University, what is today the Dawood University. And so it has caught on from there. And if I'm not wrong, most of the architects and planners who are involved in community work and experimentation are the result of this comprehensive environmental design project. What else can I tell you? I have tried to write down all that I have learned in the form of textbooks, in the form of travel logs, in the form of observations, and also the history of cities. I think that is enough.
Okay, that's wonderful. So we're going to jump on to our next question. And I would like to know if you faced any sociocultural challenges during your during the initial, creating the mapping and the housing work.
Look, we began the mapping project in 1981. At that time, there was no digital mapping. There was no satellite surveys. So we did this on foot. We had no maps. It would have taken ages on foot. So I decided that we would just have walk-through maps. Doesn't matter if there was a fault in the lengths of the lanes, etc. As long as we knew there was a lane here, there were so many houses, that was all right. Because if we had gone into plan surveying, it would have taken ages, and we didn't have ages because the requests were pouring in. So that is when we began this. And our initial mapping was of the Urangi settlement, so that we knew where the lanes were. And then we mapped each lane that applied for a sewage line. So we knew where the sewage line would be laid and where the outfall of that sewage line would be. So we mapped all the outfalls as well. This is very crude and initial mapping. But as technology came in, we tried to adopt that and failed because we couldn't find people from Urangi who even had the vaguest of idea about what all this about. That is when we initiated the training program for mapping for young people in Urangi. Initially, for a couple of years, I looked after it. But after that, it was handed over to Praveen. And she then developed this mapping through the people she trained at the unit that was created. I had very little involvement in it except reviewing it. It was her work and the work of our ninjas, as she called them. So that progressed, and we were able to map out in better detail than we had done previously the same things.
Okay, and I just want to return to a statement that you mentioned that this was during Ziaul Huq's regime, and you resigned from your post. I'm wondering, did you have any significant consequences to that by resigning, perhaps leaving your project temporarily? If you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, no, the Appropriate Technology Development Organization suffered immensely because Kibria was not there anymore. And the people who had worked with me, like me, were not there anymore. And he also had a martial law accusation and short trial for nepotism, for involving people who were not sufficiently qualified for the job. And in that trial, he said that he believed in nepotism because like that he could find people who were like-minded. So he agreed, yes, there was nepotism. So that trial didn't last very long. I think 2 hearings, and the 3rd hearing never happened.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Um, okay, we're going to ask some questions about Praveen because she continued on the
Yes.
work. Could you please tell us something about Praveen's work? When did she join OPP? Um, and why did she think mapping was important?
But we joined the Urangi pilot project in 1983. She was a young graduate. I had been a teacher at the university. And when she joined, I didn't think she would stay in Urangi. What we call an English medium girl. She was an English medium girl in a Punjabi and Urdu-speaking world, so I didn't think it would last. She had problems in the beginning. The social organizers were rude to her because they thought, look, this woman, young woman, so young, and she's come into our world, and they were Urangi residents. And so they didn't cooperate. But she was very tenacious. She stuck on where others had gone, left because of similar reasons. She just stuck on, and she was a woman. The others had been men. She stuck on. And over time, she developed a relationship for 3 or 4 years. She developed a relationship with them and with their families. I think what was important was developing a relationship with their families, with their wives, with their children, which was something Akhtar Hamid Khan or I never did. And so here was someone from the OPP who developed these close relationships with actual communities rather than just heads of families. She had a lot of learning to do about mapping, why the mapping was taking place, how it was to be done. And she learned very quickly. And the first job that she did in mapping, excuse me, was organizing a survey of parts of the settlement with 40 students from the university. So those 40 students mapped certain areas, and Praveen was given the job of looking after the mapping and of having it drawn up by them. And she did very well. For the fact that she had just done this for 4 or 5 years, she did extremely well. In 1987, a lot of responsibility was given to her, not only in the mapping program, but also looking after the sewage drains that were being laid. And by then, she was on excellent terms with the lane managers and with the community and with the staff generally. I think her greatest asset was her charm, her openness, her friendliness with everyone, irrespective of who they were, her politeness. And yet, at the same time, she was, as the Americans say, how do you say it? Hard cookie or sharp cookie, whatever it is. She was very firm and stuck to her views. As a matter of fact, Akhtar Hamid Khan used to say she's such an obstinate girl. She just doesn't listen to anyone. But once she got something in her mind, she stuck to it. And then after, I think it was, I would say, 1999 that Akhtar Hamid Khan died. And that was the time when I ceased to be the technical advisor to the OPP, officially ceased to be, and became its chairperson. So that was, and Praveen became the director. And then I think she was able to do things that she felt strongly about, like the change of rural land into urban, forced evictions to make that happen, the water crisis in Karachi. These things she felt for, and she involved herself and her team in this.
Praveen worked closely with the Sindh Kachi Abadi Authority, and she did mapping of this. I'm wondering what the scale was of the work. How big was the project, and how did it help in leasing uh, the work of SKA?
Well, there are three components here. One was training the Sindh Kachi Abadi people to understand and practice the Urangi concept of a program that had two distinct components. One was that the people did and financed themselves, and the other was what the state financed. So I think our work with the Sindh Kabji Abadi Authority, most of it, was identifying the big components which the Sindh Kachi Abadi Authority would construct. And the people would link them up link themselves up with these components by smaller components. So there were two things here. This is number one. Number two was the leasing process in the Kachi Abadis. Before, you had a long process to get a lease. You had to visit government departments, you had to have maps made, etc., and then you would apply for a lease. Now, what the OPP suggested and what was followed by Tasneem Siddiqui, who was head of the Kachi Abadi Authority, was that there would be a bank in the settlement, temporarily open. There would be a registrar temporarily put up in the settlement, and everything would be done within the settlement. And it would be a one-window operation rather than 4 or 5 agencies dealing with it. So that was the second component. The third was the actual financial arrangements. So in this arrangements, the leasing finance and the government subsidy was divided into 3. 30% for the administrative aspects of the Kachi Abadi Authority, 30% for the development of the large infrastructure, and 30% was for a fund that would revolve to make more and more large-scale interventions. So these were these 3 components, and they were carried out. Now the scale. The scale was huge on paper because these settlements had been surveyed by the Urangi Pilot Project and by the Sindh Kachi Abadi Authority together. They had been costed, the infrastructure that required, both the infrastructure at the government level, the main drains, and the lane drains at the community level. So this had already been done for almost all of Karachi. And I would say that these large drains served approximately a population of 2 million people. Because 2 million people were able to connect to these lanes. That doesn't mean they're all connected, no. I think half of them probably connected. But the possibility of connection was there. And I'm sure, although I'm no more involved, I'm sure that they are still connecting. So the main drain is there. The other thing that happened, which is very important, was that the concept to turn the natural drainage system into covered drains carrying sewage and stormwater was adopted by its principles were adopted by the Karachi Municipal Corporation. And the plan that has been made, which is called S3, is very much on those principles and is being constructed right now.
Okay, so just because of how large this project was, I just have a few questions about the funding. How did you acquire the initial funds and how did you keep these funds up? Um, and any information about the ADB loan as well.
Actually, as far as funding is concerned, most of the funds of the lane drainage system came from the people themselves. And as I told you, the lease money, 30% of it went into funding the main drains. And the rest of the funds came from this Karachi Municipal Corporation. There was no foreign funding at all, not a penny.
How was mapping used to detect water theft in Karachi and make a case for not applying for the ADB loan?
Well, it was like this. The ADB had a huge $100 million project. And that the bills of quantity of that was sent to me to see if they were okay. And I noticed one item which was horrendously huge. And so I sent that to the OPP and I said, can you go through these figures? Because this item is so large that if I take the contract for it, many generations of my family won't have to work. So Praveen took a look at it. Then we took a look at it together and we realized that it was grossly overestimated. So we went to the governor and told him, and the governor said, why should I believe you? So we said, all right, we'll apply the current government rates to these quantities and give you a figure. So we did a little bit of surveying first, and then Praveen did a detailed survey of the area. Her team and her did a detailed survey. And then we applied the government rates, and the cost came down to 30 million US dollars. So from 100 million, we came down to 30. And then the governor said, all right, let's see what my engineers say. And they looked at that. And yes, we were not too far wrong. And so the loan was cancelled because of the enormous difference between the loan and the actual cost of the project.
About the mapping itself now, can you tell us how many maps were created and who?
So I would say that we must have over 2,000, 3,000 maps, 2,000 to 3,000 maps, easily. Maps of 5,000 Kachhi Abadis have been published, and approximately 200 villages that were being transformed into urban land have also been published. Those books are available, but the maps are much more than what the books have. Their infrastructure is marked. Sewage lines, water lines, schools, mosques, all that is marked.
Can you discuss eviction stopping around Karachi's railway track?
The circular railway?
Yeah.
What do you want to know about the circular railway?
How did you end up stopping the evictions? And how did you develop that area?
Well, it's something like this. The circular railway really started functioning properly in 1960, 59, 60. And initially it was a goods train that connected the industrial area of Karachi, the two in the main industrial areas and the port to the main line. So goods could travel that way, what we call upcountry, towards the northern Sindh and Punjab. But then its potential as a passenger carrier was realized, and it became a circular railway for passengers living in Karachi. And it was a very good, the location was very good because it connected Karachi's four main industrial areas. And it connected these industrial areas to certain working class areas as well. So it became very popular. But over time, like everything in Pakistan, it ran into immense losses. It could not function without a major subsidy, and the federal and provincial governments didn't want to give it subsidy. So it quality started to decline. Meanwhile, Karachi expanded beyond the circular railway. So there was a need for transportation more of people who lived beyond the circular railway than within the circle.
So how come there was these losses that you're talking about?
Well, transport is always subsidized. And here there were other factors also. one of the factors was that the transport lobby in Karachi, the buses, the people who owned the buses, got in cahoots with the railway authorities and saw to it that the trains did not function during hours when they were most needed. And certain routes were cancelled, like the route to the Karachi University. Its timing was changed so that the students were not able to use it. There was a big conspiracy against this mode of transport. And there were those also who wanted Karachi to have a light rail system and have elevated transitways, which were promoted by the World Bank in a big way. So I think all these factors put together, it ran at a loss. And eventually in 1997, they shut it down. Now, after they shut it down, it's been a strange history. There have been attempts to revive it as a modern rail system with light rail, air conditioning, artificial intelligence, and all that. But it has always turned out to be so expensive that it could not be justified. So it kept getting delayed. Finally, the government decided that it should be a part of the CPEC. With the Chinese help, it should be done. First, they prepared a elaborate plan with the Japanese, with JICA, for its revival. Then they prepared a plan with the Chinese for revival. But meanwhile, the Supreme Court decided that it should be revived immediately. So they passed an order that it should be revived within, I don't remember, 5 weeks or something. What they didn't realize was that it could not be revived because 2 bridges on the circle had been demolished to make way for the Green Line bus system, BRT, Bus Rapid Transit. And it's interesting that neither the court knew about it, and nor did the railway authorities know, the senior railway authorities, that these 2 bridges didn't exist. So the court ordered the demolition of the houses that came in the way, although the railway system could not be revived. And though demolition began, there were 4,000 houses, and they demolished 1,110 or something like that. And the fact is that in spite of that demolition, the railway could not be revived because of the reason I've told you. Now, after these houses were demolished, the Urban Resource Center began a big campaign against that demolition. And as a result of which the rest of the houses were not demolished. But these 1,100 and some houses were demolished. And the court, after their demolition, told the provincial government that they should rehabilitate the people whose houses they had demolished. Now, this is a strange thing that the court has done many times. After ordering demolitions, they order rehabilitation rather than as a part of that whole demolition process. So the way that this was done was press conferences at the press club, demonstrations, regular writings in the press, interviews of the people whose homes had been demolished. Special attention was paid to children who had lost their education because of demolitions. They couldn't go to school anymore. Even the schools had been demolished in some cases. So education becomes a very important subject in these demolitions.
And so what was the role of mapping? Did you or
I'll come to that.
Okay.
So this was undertaken. Then details of those who had been demolished, their numbers, how life had been affected as a result. The other thing that Fayyaz Saab has just pointed out was the role of mapping. The entire circle was mapped out by the Urban Resource Center and the OPP together. The whole circle, all the buildings and housing and commercial activity, industrial activity that was along the railway was mapped. And we saw as a result that I think it was only 18% of the length of the railroad had been encroached upon by Kachi Abadis, by poor settlements, whereas the rest had been encroached upon by formal sector industry and formal sector housing. For instance, the Awami Markaz, which is where most of facilities that people use as banks, etc., the big center, that was encroaching upon it. A Pepsi Cola factory was encroaching upon it. Railway colonies built formally by the railways for the employees were encroaching upon it. So all this was mapped, and these maps are made available to the citizens who lived along the railway, and the Urban Resource Center offered its offices for them to meet, discuss, hold forums, which they did. So it became quite clear that these problems were not just Kachi Abadi issues, but they were a lot of formal sector, industries, warehousing, and official buildings and official housing that was also encroaching upon the railroad, on the what is known as the railway right of way. Now I don't remember exactly, but the court had asked, the railway had asked, and the court had agreed to 100 feet on either side of the track as a railway right of way. Whereas in Japan, bullet trains travel with a right of way of only 50 feet on either side. So all that was made public. And slowly the court more or less withdrew from this discussion. And the local authorities also decided to leave things as they were. So that is how it has been for the last, now it's at 4 years now, 5th year coming. The people are still there on the ruins of their house. Their main problem is water, which has been cut off by the government, sewage, and children's education.
Yeah, before we move on to the next question, how come they let so many houses be destroyed before advocacy began again? I mean, it's not like these houses were empty houses, families were living there. How did pushback just not begin immediately, even say after the first house was destroyed?
No, the movement began just when the first house was declared. As a matter of fact, even before. When it was declared 3 days earlier that they were going to carry out the demolition, the movement had already begun. There were demonstrations, there were people went to court also against the decision. And the court was very slow because it was because of the court's own orders that they were being demolished.
Okay. I would say that makes sense, but it doesn't, because how can the court be taking out injustice? But for now, we'll move on to the next question.
The court has done this not once, it has done this 3 times since 2018.
Since 2018?
Yeah.
And what kind of advocacy is taking place? Is no one holding the courts accountable for this? Like the local courts versus the provincial courts versus, say, even the federal government?
These are decisions of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And they have been challenged, and the Supreme Court has not done anything about it. There have been petitions, they have been dismissed. And the provincial government has promised, I don't know, crores of rupees for the rehabilitation of these people, but no rehabilitation has been done to date.
Oh my gosh.
This is quite common, by the way, in India, in Pakistan, in the Philippines. This is quite common, unfortunately. But one has to understand that this is new. Previously, the courts have a lot of pro-poor judgments. But I think, let's say 2015, 16, 17, the courts somehow started to change all over South Asia, not only here.
Okay. Shouldn't there be like total outrage at this point? Like some kind of like mass protest that breaks out over lack of housing?
There have been mass protests, and there's a big but, they used to be held previously because the police was involved. In these recent protests, the Rangers, which is a paramilitary force, has been used to crush the protests, arrest the protesters, leaders, and lock them up. So this is a big difference between the earlier protests and the protests now. It's not only the police's involvement, and people are scared because now you disappear and you disappear forever sometimes.
Interesting. Okay, similarly on that note, I want to go to the 4 barriers that were identified during the OPP's planning, the psychological, social, economical, and technological barriers.
Yeah.
Would you argue that that those have been eliminated? Because we see consistency in the fact that they haven't. Get this public reform that suddenly the society will develop when currently they're growing up in situations that are less than ideal.
They will not create the public sector reform. Public sector reform is essentially the job of the politicians and the bureaucrats in association with important civil society organizations and with academic institutions. That is what would be a public sector reform. Otherwise, you cannot have reform. And then, of course, people would need to be presented with these reform possibilities. I mean, in this sanitation policy, for instance, we held numerous workshops, provincial workshops, also city workshops, to whom we presented people with what we intended to do. And because of them, policy changed all the time. That whole year and a half that we did this, the policy evolved because we were holding workshops, we were holding community meetings. So you would have to go through that process. And a government that is willing to do it.
Yeah, I feel like that's a huge key piece that we're missing, the government's willingness.
I think one has to understand the different phases through which Karachi has passed. When we began the OPP, 1980-81, there was a psychological barrier. People said that the state should do this. Why should we do it? And that barrier was there. And that barrier exists even today in many locations. But by and large, throughout the city of Karachi, that barrier has disappeared. People now collect money and do work themselves. They have realized that they have no other option. And this is not only because of the OPP, it is also because people themselves realized that they could do something. They could get a water connection legally by pressurizing their councillors or their MNAs or MPAs. They could do that. Alternatively, they could steal water by putting a pipe in the night to their neighborhood. So they have been doing this now. Sewage has been difficult because sewage needs a point where it disposes, and that is not easily available. So those settlements which were near a natural drain, or nala as we call it, they were able to connect. And they have done, a lot of them have done this themselves, collected money each household and connected it to the nearest drain. So that they have done. So psychological barrier, I think, to a great degree has disappeared. Now we come to the other barrier, which is the social barrier. In the case of sewage and even water, a number of people have got, or households have to come together. One household can't do this, can't afford this. So they have to form some sort of an organization, have some sort of a leader, some sort of an activist who gets together, who gets people together and collects the money and then carries out the work. Now, over here, there are many sources of money. One is known as a BC committee, where, and this is mostly done by women, where you form a women's group and they all collect money and then one woman gets it. So in this, periodically, the person who gets it changes. So this has been done quite a lot for not only building houses, but also contributing to the building of sewage lines. So that's the social and economic barrier. But the most serious barrier has been the technical barrier, because they don't know how to lay a sewage line. They don't know how to take levels. And when there is no water, they don't know how to design a sewage system where there is no water that flushes the system. So for this, they need advice. And the OPP has provided that advice to a population, I think in Karachi, to a population about nearly 2 million, I would say. And then what happens is that the masons that you use to building the system under OPP advice, they become contractors because they have learned, and so the system multiplies. They've learned by working for the OPP, then they become contractors, they offer their services to neighborhoods who wish to do it.
So would you say then that because so many people are being trained, so many people are receiving at least the advice to start implementing sewage systems, how come there isn't rapid fire expansion? Would you just say that there's not enough technology to go around?
So there is not a what?
Like rapid fire expansion of taking Kachi Abadis and putting them into urban settlements. Why aren't they more quicker? Is my question.
No, Kachi Abadis are going to multiply.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Kachi Abadi issue is essentially a land issue.
Okay.
Where do you build your settlement? Where do you go and live? So formally, there is no way that you can live, but there's a very important informal system of land grabbers who grab land, subdivide it, and sell it to people who need it. And so the settlements increase rapidly. And it takes a settlement a lot of time before they develop the relations to collectively work in putting sewage or water lines, and then to lobby with their MNAs and MPAs to pave those streets. So it's a long process. It takes about 10 to 12 years before a settlement can even begin to have services.
Okay, so my next question is considering the success of the OPP and its recurring model on its recurring case studies on the model of how it's successful. I believe it's called the component sharing model. How come it's not implemented more consistently throughout other Pakistani towns?
Has it not implemented what? Sorry, I didn't get that.
Oh, sorry. The component sharing model and the general model of the Rangi pilot project, why it's not implemented across Pakistani towns and cities.
Well, that is because of the OPP's own method of working. The OPP trains and advises, and it carries out supervision, which is periodic, it's not regular. So if the organization which is working at a particular site in Pakistan If it has learned, if it has understood, if its activists are good, the model is replicated. If not, it is replicated badly. Now, OPAP has been replicated in very large number of towns in the Punjab and in Sindh, and a few cases in KP as well. And it's not a small replication. It would be, I think, about 150,000 houses must have benefited by OPP's work. And it is also true that many of those closed down their work after they had served their neighborhood. They did not go on to do other neighborhoods. But there are cases like Uch, for example, and Lodran, where they expanded their work into other settlements and are still continuing to expand their work, but it is really a drop in the ocean of need. Yes, that is true.
And what would you suggest would make this drop in the ocean a more bigger body body of water? Like, what would make it more efficient? What would make it bigger?
You know, we framed a sanitation policy for Pakistan, which proposed the adoption of this model. And this model was adopted by the UNDP also for its pilot projects, and it was very successful. It was also adopted by the Lodran pilot project. Also, it was successful. But unless this becomes a state policy, it will be the component sharing model. It will be difficult for it to grow. For example, we had proposed in the sanitation policy that all developers have to develop where sanitation can be disposed of, points of disposal. And we had said that neighborhoods should be left to their own, that they should do this work themselves. And they did in many cases. Even in the formal sector, they did. That happened. But that again was too small. So unless it is made compulsory for people that the bigger elements like trunks and treatment plants should be done by the government, and the rest should be left to the developers, formal and informal, to communities, to citizens groups. It is not going to happen.
Okay, well, okay, suppose it becomes a state policy. I mean, to some extent, it was adopted by the government. How can you expect that the government will deliver, considering that just in 2018, 3 times they have demolished houses? How can you rely on the government to, start implementing big water plantation systems and sewage systems so that the local communities can start to develop?
You can't. You have to force the government to do it. It's not something, if they can make an atomic bomb, they can surely organize this. It's not a difficult thing to do, especially when the training material is available, when those who have done it are available. It's simply a matter of getting rid of the old system. It's not easy to get rid of old systems. You have to be politically very strong to get rid of old systems. There's a lot of money in these systems. There's a lot of beneficiaries of this system. Contractors, for one, are the biggest beneficiaries. So
in
it's
your
not
opinion,
easy. You cannot replace this. It's difficult to replace unless there is very strong political backing to it.
Okay, so in your opinion, what's the biggest inefficiency to the governments?
I think there's a system in place. It has engineers, it has contractors, big ones and small ones. It has developers. It has manufacturers of materials, and they would suffer if the system is replaced. So they don't want it replaced, and they are powerful. So unless you have powerful government and the willingness of the government to do this, where there was a willingness, it happened. Where there was no willingness, it didn't happen.
I feel like this is just a cyclical problem. I mean, you have to expect that the government will do something, but instead they don't do it, then you're stuck with inconsistency and efficiency within these societies, just like in developing local communities. So how do we get rid of this, just toxic cycle of rely on the government doesn't deliver, people stay in, developing circumstances.
In my opinion, which I've also written about, you need a major public sector reform. Without that reform, the whole system remains in place. You have to decentralize, but decentralization has its own problems. So you decentralize slowly over a period of time. You build the necessary training centers in certain districts. We had suggested 3 centers in the Punjab, 2 sectors in Sindh, 2 training centers in Sindh, 2 centers in KP, and 1 in Quetta. And it never happened. So you train and you follow what the trainers say. You have manuals which have already been written, and you map the existing systems, so you know where they are, what they are. We don't have maps of the existing systems.
So I know we're straying a little bit away from further, from the topic of mapping, but I just have to ask. When we see successful development projects taking place in Pakistan, a lot of the people that are initiating these projects, they're people who are already, almost finished their careers or at the late stages of their career. How come we don't see, students straight out of university, straight out of masters, straight out of like law school, med school, beginning these projects and being super successful with them?
This is a big discussion. All I can say is that there is a major difference between the younger generation, whom I have been teaching for many years, and my generation, and even the generation after me. The major difference is that the present generation is individualistic, it is materialistic, it has no ideology that it can turn to as the previous. It was an age of ideologies in my time. That age is gone. And secondly, which is very important, everything has become extremely technical. Before, technology was subservient to politics, it was subservient to social conditions. It was used for the promotion of certain types of sociology. All that has changed. We have to understand what has happened. And I think we don't understand what has happened. The youth has their own vocabulary. It's a different vocabulary from the one I was used to. Gender relations and family structures have undergone a huge change. It's not the same thing. And this has to be understood and accommodated. And not accommodated is the wrong word. If you don't accommodate it, it'll accommodate itself with the passage of time. So I think there is a big gap here.
I'm just going to ask if you could share a story or anecdote with us from this entire project, even from your time until after Praveen took over.
You want an anecdote? I can tell you many anecdotes. I'll have to choose which one to tell you. Well, we've had, I think the main problem that we had, apart from some litigation and accusations of blasphemy against Dr. Hamid Khan, was our dealings with the UN. We had a UN advisor. He was a very good engineer and a very good human being. Our differences with him were that he was an engineer and we were not. And over there, the differences became very sharp. For instance, he wanted our offices not to be in Urangi. but to be in some nice posh place in Karachi. He did not want the social organizers to be Urangi residents. He called them muscle men. He wanted university graduates. He wanted a specific project area as a demonstration area. We didn't want any of these things. He wanted surveys of water, of how much is used when one goes to the toilet. And we said, nothing doing. Here is a lota, you know what a lota is. Here is a lota, this is the amount of water that is used. So there was always this problem of a conflict between the engineer's view and Akhtar Hamid Khan's view of how things should be. I think there are many anecdotes related to this whole relationship. Finally, we separated. Otherwise, there are other anecdotes also. Akhtar Hamid Khan's own issues with the government. That is also many anecdotes about that. Once the chief minister of the Punjab was coming to Rangi, and before he came, his staff, the protocol staff, came over. They wanted to see the cups. They wanted to see what food would be given to him. And Akhtar Hamid Khan shooed them away. He said, we are only going to give him tea, and this is going to be in our own cups. If he doesn't like it, he need not come. But he came, and he appreciated the fact that this had been done. So there are many stories.
Well, on that note, we are running out of time, and I think we've received lots of good information here. So I think we'll conclude the interview here. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, thank you very much for having had me and having spoken to me. Thank you.